Okay, so my name is Jesse Scott. I'm a software engineer at Puppet, and I've spent a significant part of the past year working on the Puppet development kit, and we were super happy to release it in August so that you guys can start using it. So hopefully after today, when I ask who has installed it, everybody's going to raise their hand. All right, so I am on a team at Puppet called the Puppet Developer Experience Team, and this extremely long sentence is our charter. What it boils down to is we're trying to make your lives easier as Puppet developers. So we're looking for places in the workflows of a Puppet developer that are painful right now, and we're trying to make them better. So what is the PDK? Our slogan for the PDK is the shortest path to better modules. So what that means is we're just trying to make it super easy to get started with Puppet development. We've heard from a lot of people that they spend hours or days like getting Ruby installed and getting Bundler installed and finding all the right gems and getting their gem file working and all that stuff. Literally, like, people come up to us all the time and they're like, yeah, every new developer, it's like an entire day to get them to the point where they can write a single line of Puppet code. So one of the big deals with the PDK is that we have OS native packages for Windows, Mac OS, a bunch of Linux distros, more coming soon, that you download one package, install it, and like that's all you need to do. It's got a Ruby baked in, it's got Git inside, it's got all the gems you need inside. So there's just a CLI that it presents, and that's all you need to use. One of the things about it having Ruby inside and Git inside is we really want you guys to consider those to be implementation details of the PDK. If you really dig around, you can like find the Ruby interpreter and do things with it, but you're kind of off on your own at that point. We want you to interact with the PDK through the PDK command line interface. And if that's not working for you or doesn't support something you want to do, we want to hear what that is so we can just like make it better. We surprisingly are not super excited about just like supporting Ruby installations on everybody's computer. Yes, next. So why use the PDK? As I said, we want to get your development environment going super fast. We also want, there's a lot of people that have a development environment going, but they're not doing any like linting of their code, or they're not doing unit testing. And a lot of that is, there's like a bunch of different tools out there for doing those things, and people don't know what to use. There's like blog posts from 2011 about what to use, but those gems don't install anymore or whatever. So yeah, we want to like kind of codify what we think you should be using and make it super easy to use them. And there's this idea of shifting left. You may have heard that in other people's talks. But the idea is if you have kind of your development workflow on a screen from left to right, like the left side is your workstation, you're writing Puppet code, and the far right side is your production environment's code running on your servers. And we want you to find bugs and like issues when you're still on your workstation, before you've like even pushed to Git, before you've merged a pull request, before you've deployed to staging or production. Like, we want you to see those problems as soon as possible, because then you can fix them super fast. So that was all kind of like better experience, but we also just want you to write better modules. So we've got a module skeleton that we've kind of gone out and collected what we think are the best parts from a bunch of existing module skeletons, and kind of made one Frankenstein module skeleton that has everything good and how we like it. We also like pre-configure a bunch of things when you generate a new module, like a gitignore file and stuff for AppVeyor and Travis, so that even if you're not using those things right now, when you go to use them later, like it's just kind of set up and works for you. And maybe you have to tweak it a little bit, but it's like 90% there already. And as I said, there's a lot of people that just aren't doing syntax checking and linting and unit testing, and they're like finding bugs when they deploy it to production, which isn't ideal. And then Lindsay made us put in a thing about Puppet task support. So you may have heard something about Puppet tasks today, and the PDK can help you like generate those scripts and especially generate the metadata that's going to like help people use them. So this is a list of a lot of the tools that we've included in the PDK. We've got Puppet syntax, Puppet lint, Metadata JSON lint, Rubocop for Ruby linting, and then on the unit testing side, there's a bunch of RSpec stuff. And a lot of the intention behind this is these were kind of already what the community had settled on as really good tools, but we really want to like focus everybody on making those tools better. We're not, as again, just like with Ruby and Git, you should kind of consider these to be implementation details. So if a year from now somebody comes up with a much better way to lint Puppet code, like the PDK might start using it, but you're going to run the same PDK command and not even know that something under the hood changed. But again, this is kind of where the state of things are right now. And then who should use the PDK? Perhaps unsurprisingly, we think everyone should use the PDK. It's super awesome for brand new Puppet developers. As I've said several times, you install one package and like you're ready to go in 5 minutes instead of a day. It's also great for existing developers who want to start unit testing or start syntax checking or start linting their stuff. Maybe you've been intimidated by that, you don't know how to get started, so this is going to give you a really kind of direct workflow to get started on that. And there are more features coming real soon now to make the PDK, make the process of kind of adopting a module you already have into the PDK workflow even easier. And Bryan is actually going to talk a little bit more about that later today. Oh, one more thing I wanted to mention. Who here like has to get approval to install something on their workstation at work? Yeah, there's quite a few people. So do you think it's an easier process to get like one package from one vendor approved or like 10 packages approved? So this is one package you have to get approved through your approval. And actually, if you kind of stay within the like default workflow for PDK, there's no internet access actually required at runtime. Like all the gems are already in there, so it doesn't have to go out and get anything. So also if you work somewhere where you don't necessarily have internet access all the time, it can be pretty helpful. All right, so that was a lot of talking, and now I'm gonna like show it to you. Here, there we go. All right, so I have a brand new Windows 10 workstation here. There was a video resolution issue, so I can't show you the window that says that I just finished installing the PDK, but I just finished installing the PDK. I'm honest, you can trust me. So we're going to open up PowerShell here. Oops, let's just make that big. Is that big enough for people to see? Yes, in the back? Cool. Okay, so first of all, there's nothing up my sleeve. If we ask for Ruby, there is no Ruby. So let's just do PDK help. So there's the help. We have PDK installed. It seems to be working. Okay. Just going to get a drink real quick. So let's make a new module. PDK, new module, test mod. So what this is going to do is it's going to ask me a few questions just so we can fill out the metadata JSON the way I want. It's smart enough that once you give it an answer for like what your Forge username is, it's going to remember that for next time. And then you can also pass a flag to just skip this whole interview process if you want to do the metadata yourself later. There's also defaults for everything, so you can just kind of hit enter and go along. We get down here, it's asking what operating systems our module is going to support. let's add OS 10. Keep going, default, default, default. And then it spits out the metadata JSON it's going to write. We can scroll through, make sure that looks cool, and say yes. So then it says, hey, I made a module at this path. You can go in there and do some stuff. So let's go and look what it just created. So I hope this is big enough to read. This is just a list of all the files that it already laid down for us. So you can see in here there's a git ignore, pmt ignore, rubocop config, all that stuff. There's a gem file. And then here's the metadata.json that it just wrote for us. So one thing the interview does not yet ask you about is dependencies. So let's add a dependency here. I'm going to depend on Puppet abs standard lib. I'm using Visual Studio Code, by the way. If you haven't seen the official Puppet extension for Visual Studio Code, it's very cool. Go talk to James Pogren about it. He loves it. And he wrote it. So let's add a dependency on standard lib. That looks good. And now I made a change to my metadata, so I'd really like to make sure, I don't know, who here has ever had any trouble writing JSON by hand? Okay, just like one guy. So let's go back and make sure I did it right. So I'm going to say PDK validate metadata. Oops, got to go into the module first. So the first thing it did there was check to see that if I wrote valid JSON, which I thankfully did. And the second thing it did was metadata JSON lint, which is like stylistic things about your metadata JSON. And in this case, it said, hey, you added this dependency, but you didn't put a end on the version range. You said you're going to support every future version of standard lib from now until the heat death of the universe, which is a rather bold claim. So we recommend people put a end on their version ranges. So it's caught that for me, so I'll go in and do that. Now I'll go back, try this again. Hey, likes that better, great. So I caught a problem super fast. Before I published to the Forge, and it docked my score because I had an open-ended dependency in my version range. There's a little info message there at the bottom. That's just the metadata validation includes now validating task metadata, and all that's telling us is that there weren't any tasks in the module, so it didn't validate anything for tasks. Okie doke. Oops. So let's show. So metadata is just one of the validations. If we do help validate, oops. Let's validate --list is going to show us the list of available validators. I'm sorry, that's at the bottom. So there's a metadata validator, Puppet validator, and Ruby validator. We can run one of those singly. We can run any set of two, or we can just say PDK validate, and it's going to run them all. So again, there's the tasks one, and then there's also a couple about Puppet telling us that it didn't validate any Puppet code because there's no Puppet manifests in this module yet. We don't add any classes by default, but you may be shocked to learn that we can say PDK new class. In this case, I gave it a class name that was the same as my module name, so it was smart enough to know it should generate an it.pp. If I gave it a different class name, it would generate classname.pp. And it also told us it created a spec file for that class. So there's actually a unit test for that class already, which is pretty cool. So now if we run PDK validate again, Now it's actually checking our Puppet manifest syntax and style. We still don't have any tasks, but we'll get to that. And then one thing I wanted to show you guys, it's not the default right now, it might at some point, but validate takes a -- parallel flag, and then it does it all at the same time. So that's pretty cool. Okay, let's go back to VS Code. And let's go ahead and look at that spec test that it added for us. Oops, that's not what I want. Test mod spec. So it just added this whole test file for us. This test is not particularly complex, but what it does do is it gets the list of all the supported OSs from our metadata.json, and it's going to loop over it, and then using RSpec Puppet Facts, which is a gem that has factor data for a huge number of OSs and platforms, it's going to use the facts for that supported platform and just make sure that our manifest compiles on all those platforms. So it's a really simple test, but it is an actual test of something, and as your manifest gets more complicated, that may actually start to show up things. But this is really like a first step for unit testing so that there's something there you can start with. It's a lot easier to add a second test to a file than the first test to a file in a lot of cases. So this is already here. Let's go back and run it. PDK test unit. So this is looping over the RPM platforms, the Deb platforms, OS 10, and Windows, and just making sure our catalog or our manifest compiles into a catalog on all those platforms. Takes, I think, about 15 seconds here. There we go. And we see we ran 12 tests, no failures. Hooray! And again, you've all heard something about Puppet tasks today, I hope. We have a command for that, pdk new task. Let's call it restart. And this just lays down a couple of really simple files for us. We can go over here and look at them. It made a tasks directory. And so we've got a restart.sh, which is basically just a bunch of comments telling you, you can write a shell script here, and here's all the information about getting started. Here's some information about writing your metadata. And then it's actually also created the metadata for this task with just kind of a template you can get started with here. You can add your parameters. And then now that this file exists, if we went in there and added our parameters, that's not what I wanted to do. We can now, once again, do pdk validate. And it checked our task metadata style. And it actually has a JSON schema for task metadata and will tell you, hey, you have the wrong type for this thing. Oh, I was going to demo that, actually. Let's just make a mistake here. Let's turn this Boolean into a string. Go back. And it'll actually complain, hey, that field of type string did not match Boolean. So again, it's all about catching errors before you've even committed your code. And I think that is actually all my demo. So I'm going to hand you off to Bryan, who's going to tell you about a lot more cool stuff.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bryan Jen. I'm also on the PDE team. Prior to joining the PDE team, I was on the modules team. So as you can tell, I'm pretty excited about what we're doing with the PDK. However, we're also keeping a conscious mind of modules developers that have pre-existing modules as well. So show of hands, how many modules developers do we have out there right now? All right. And how many of those modules are currently being linted and tested? OK. Far smaller subset. So what I'm going to demonstrate today is adapting, where's the clicker? So adapting your existing module to be compatible with the PDK. So it's very important that you start with a fresh clone of your module. And if you have pre-existing tests and linting in your module already, it's important that those tools match with what the PDK is packaged with. So things like Puppet lint, Metadata JSON lint, RSpec Puppet, Rake. Those tools will directly translate to your existing module so that you can use the PDK to validate and test your module. So part of those steps is looking at your gem file. How much stuff do you have in your gem file? Whether you need to munge and merge your gem file with the default gem file, the PDK, those type of decisions need to be made. Do you run Rubocop? What kind of cops do you have? Is it using the latest Rubocop linting cops and styles? If you're not using Rubocop at all, you can just copy the Rubocop template from the PDK module template. And when you run PDK validate, make sure your internet connection is connected because PDK will resolve those missing dependencies and download the gems into its cache. And what I'm going to show you now is demo time. Oops. Oh, sorry. All right. So what we've already done was clone a fresh copy of the Puppet Labs MOTD module. Something super old, but super simple so that we can use for this, the sake of this demo. And it's a fresh clone. And since it's a Puppet Labs module, I know that the tools that we use to test and lint this module are pretty consistent with what we use with PDK. So what I can do is copy the gem file and the Rubocop file from the freshly generated module that Jesse just made. And after I do that, I can run PDK validate. As you can see, we're going to go ahead and check all the resolve all the dependencies. We didn't see any missing dependencies, and we're going to run validation. And oh no. Oh no. As you can see, we have a ton of Ruby linting errors, right? At this point, what we can do really quickly is run PDK validate Ruby -a. -a will send autocorrect to the Rubocop underneath Ruby validator. And we will try to clean up as many warnings and errors as possible. As you can see, tons of them are being corrected now. So let's try running validate again. And we are now down to 6. So for the sake of this demo, I'm not going to go into each one of those files and fix those lint errors. So the next thing we're going to show you is if you have tests, if those tests are green, running RSpec Puppet, then they should be green whenever you run them with PDK. This being a Puppet Lab supported module, I can assure you the tests are green. I'm going to run them again. Test unit. We're going to go off and we're going to kick off some RSpec tests. A lot more tests than the freshly generated module, so bear with me. And you'll see that it ran in about 8 seconds, 18 tests, and they've all succeeded. So Now you have a module compatible with PDK. What can you do now? Well, you can use the PDK to expand on that module. You can use the generators to generate a new class, a new task, or a new defined type. Anything that you could do with PDK on a new module, you can now do with your existing module. And any new classes, defined types, will have a corresponding spec file that you can now add tests to. So all those days of no tests should be over. All right. All right, so now you have your existing module and it's compatible with PDK. What else can you do? Well, as Jesse mentioned, you're shifting left, right? Everyone should be shifting left. So you're running validation, you're running lint, you're running tests on your local workstation with the all-in-one PDK install. That being said, you can also install PDK on your CI workers so that the same setup that you're using on your workstation to run validation, linting, tests, are going to be run on your CI worker. If they pass on your local workstation, they should pass in CI. And they're going to be the same across platforms that the PDK supports. And it's also important to note that the PDK supports machine-readable output. What you've been seeing is output to screen and text. What you can do is add a -- format JUnit, and we will output XML so that you can parse that and determine your output and state programmatically. Additionally, you can do both, because why not both? You can output text to standard out so you can read it without having to muddle through some XML, and output XML to a file so that you can parse that later. PDK also has reliable exit codes. We exit 0 on success, 1 on failure. Nothing fancy to it. So when you fail, you know you failed. And you've succeeded, you know you've succeeded. So as you can see, we have a pretty standard Puppet module template that we apply on every new module. We tried to create the PDK module template as a one-size-fits-all module that everyone can use. But that's not always the case. Maybe your company has a special use case where you need to add something to the README, or you have a special license file you'd like to attach to every single module that you generate. That we allow you to do that with the, oops, sorry about that. We allow you to do that with the custom module templates. All you need to do is fork the PDK module template, add the changes that you want, and then when you run PDK, run it with a -- template URL flag. And we will generate that new module template every time you run PDK new module. But it is important to note that the PDK will be changing, module template will be changing as we add new features. So if you do fork this module, be sure you know exactly what you want to change and that you're rebasing frequently in order to keep up with what we have. And that new installations of PDK will work with your module template. So what's next for the PDK? Well, our plans are to make PDK supported with enterprise licenses. So if you're a PE customer and you want to develop with the PDK or use the PDK in your day-to-day, then we will supply support for that. Additionally, since it is open source, we want to make it helpful for all users. So we're going to continue working hard at adapting the PDK to work with your existing modules. So more features, being able to add tests to existing classes, so on and so forth. We want to make your efforts with your old modules and bring them forward to using all the new stuff that we have on PDK. And a lot of that is self-preservation, being a modules developer myself. So, and also we would like to do improved workflows for the PDK in your CI/CD deployments or installations. So using PDK to run your validations and your tests programmatically. And another thing that we want to do in the near term is package improvements. What we stress a lot is developing natively, whether you're on Windows, whether on Linux or OS X or OS X, then you'd want to be able to do all of that natively. And part of that is being able to manage your installations natively. So we'll be working on a Chocolatey package for Windows, Homebrew for Mac, and Yum and app support for your Red Hat and Debian installations. And making the install package relocatable, so you can choose where you want to install it instead of having a default location. And being, like Jesse mentioned earlier, being able to install it as a non-admin user. And last but not least, we want to add more platforms. So the more platforms we add, the more people can have access to the tools that PDK supplies. So if you're a fan of the PDK, we'd love to hear your feedback. Here's some contact information for us, for Jesse and myself. And there's an email address for the PDK team if you have any questions for the larger team. We'd love to hear feedback from you on Twitter or otherwise, good or bad. And as always, if you want some real-time discussion, we have our Slack channel and the Forge modules channel. And a little bit more information. If you'd like to read the documentation or download and try it yourself, for those that haven't done it yet, here are some links to the PDK itself, the docs. And if you're looking for the actual source code, it's all open source, and PRs are welcome, and issues are welcome. Those are our GitHub repos. And there is the previously mentioned PDK module template repo if you want to fork and create custom templates. Thanks.
We were too fast.
Yeah, I know.
I've heard you guys are working on beaker integration. Can you tell me more about that?
I'm not shocked that that was the first question.
Yeah.
I will say we recognize that acceptance testing your modules is an unsolved problem for a lot of people. And we plan to work on that. Was that vague enough?
So vendor lock-in. If I install PDK, I get everything that PDK gives, but I don't necessarily get the mix and match that I can on my own machine. So I like it, but I'm also suspicious of anything that says, here, I can do everything for you, but you have to get it from me. So
the PDK is, so the question is vendor lock-in. If you download and install PDK, does it lock you into using everything the PDK includes?
yeah, so how easy it is, as somebody who would have to go somewhere and tell 60 people, here's how you're doing modules, and then possibly say, oh wait, we have a case in our incredibly crufty old Puppet architecture that this doesn't handle. How would I back out? I'm a little worried that sort of if I love it too much, horrible things are going to happen to me.
So the PDK is really a kind of unified collection and interface layer on top of a bunch of existing open source tools. There is not, the magic is in integrating them, it's not in the tools themselves. So PDK is using Bundler under the hood to manage your modules. There's still a gem file, there's still all the stuff that's normally there. We just like run the stuff that we know you need to run. So there's not, I can't think of any reason why you couldn't stop using the PDK and start just using bundle exec things, start managing, updating the gem file. Like, you'll run into trouble if you try to have both worlds potentially, where like you're heavily customizing the gem file and still want to use all the PDK interface for things, but there shouldn't be any actual like lock-in once you've started using the PDK on something.
And it's also important to note that we just described the PDK as the all-in-one installer, right? But the PDK does come as a gem with the functionality that PDK offers in a gem. If you want to manage that yourself, I mean, it's at your own risk. We recommend using the all-in-one so that the environment and everything is consistent. But if you want to manage your environment through bundler and add your own gems and your own Ruby environment, the PDK itself is available in gem form.
We do recommend in that case that you probably want to install PDK like globally into your system gems instead of inside every bundle, just so you're not having to like constantly update it and whatnot. But yeah, that totally works too.
Could you probably show some integration of Visual Studio Code and PDK? Or is it always changing between command line and code? And
there is integration. I don't know if I can demo that off the top of my head. But if you find James Pogren and just say the words Visual Studio Code, he will start demoing it for you.
Yeah.
Doesn't it just like
There-
some of the commands inside of code? That's what
I think so. I
Yep.
think basically the little like,
Yep.
I forget what it's called, the like Omnibox thing that pops up lets you basically
Yeah.
run the commands from
So
there.
James Pogren and Glenn Sardi are the two working on the Puppet plugin for the VS Code. And they have been working diligently on adding PDK capabilities to VS Code. And I believe they will be at the Birds of a Feather Windows portion this afternoon. So go accost them if you have questions about VS Code and Puppet and PDK.
I have kind of a compound question. You focused a lot on the Visual Studio stuff. What do you have for integration on Linux-based IDEs like either Eclipse or Emacs or anything more old school? I mean, I guess I don't have to have that, but that's kind of would be nice to have.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. That's not even my main question.
Okay.
But my important question is, what's your timeline on the importing of existing modules? We've got about a 6-year-old, fairly mature Puppet environment. We're currently working on upgrading from an old version to the current version. So I'm hoping that by the time we finish that this quarter, those facilities will be available so we can start using the PDK. Are you looking at what's your timeline for that feature?
So without pissing off Lindsay too much, I can't talk about concrete timelines,
Right,
but
sorry about that.
the idea of adapting existing modules, converting modules to being PDK compatible, that is probably the highest item on our list. So you should expect something soon.
Okay, well, we'll just follow your Slack and everything and look for updates
right.
there, though. But as long as it's high priority, that sounds like it'll work out for us.
It is being actively worked on.
Yes. No spoilers. Can you go to the mic? I can't hear you.
Is there any way to like identify modules in the Forge that are PDK compliant, that are using that? Is there any sort of flag?
There is not at the moment, but that, you probably didn't catch it, but when you use the PDK to generate a new module, it actually adds a little bit of extra information in the metadata JSON about the version of PDK you used, the template you used, all that kind of stuff. So that information exists, and it's just a matter of surfacing it on the Forge, which is a fairly trivial amount of work. And you were not the first person to mention that, so I'm guessing it will happen rather soon.
So I'm gonna follow up on the previous gentleman's first question, and I hate to put you on the spot, but are there any plans to resurrect Geppetto or any sort of that functionality?
Let's see.
I would be very surprised specifically about Geppetto. I think, and I'm just talking extemporaneously here, I think the problem with having our own IDE was, or just like really focusing support on one IDE, is that it's not scalable because everybody has their own environment they want to edit with. So actually, a lot of the Visual Studio Code work has involved setting up a Puppet language server. I don't know if anybody is familiar, like Rust has a language server, but it's essentially, I think Microsoft came up with the spec for it, but it's essentially an interface for editors to ask a programming language like, hey, how do I syntax highlight this file? Or how do I, like, are there any syntax errors in this file or lint errors? So the Visual Studio Code plugin uses a Puppet language server, not to be confused with Puppet server. And there are plugins already for like Vim and Eclipse and stuff to talk to language servers. So I think the story is going to get better and better in a much more scalable way than just us making our own IDE.
Yep. But for the PDK itself, I think it's important to note that it's the plan and the direction is for it to be a standalone CLI tool, right? With being editor agnostic, so to speak. That it's a tool that if you want to add editor support, then the community can do that, and we want to enable that.
So we're starting to get more of our operation sites to finally start consuming code, or to at least to try to create modules. One of the things that in the past we've tried to at least explore was using retrospec to try to help them build their spec testing for their modules. Are you guys addressing something that might help? Like you have the basic scaffolding that gets built, but something that would actually maybe take an existing module and then build the spec testing to at least as a something to template off of.
I think that's an interesting point for part of the bullet points of the process of converting an existing module, right? Is being able to determine whether a class or a defined type has existing tests, and if it doesn't, perhaps generate it for it. It's definitely something that we can look into, but that's definitely one of the roadmap things that we need to discuss on a design board.
I will also say that it feels like there's a lot of potential for PDK and retrospect to cooperate more.
And is there any integration considered from the migration? I believe almost people here create their own Puppet development kits. Is there any easy integration, for example, like the Indiana Jones just went change the gold statue with the sandbag, and is expected to just work immediately, or need some tweaks, in your opinion?
Can you repeat that real quick?
Imagine that, for example, if I have a Puppet agent installed to mimic the kind of Puppet development kit, right? It's just uninstall this agent and install the PDK and will work as sleek, or need some adjustments?
They can both be installed at the same time. They both, the agent and PDK both have a copy of Ruby, but they do not interfere with each other. There have been a few bugs about environment variables like leaking through between, but those are definitely considered bugs, and we are squashing them as we go along.
Right.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, as you mentioned now, they both have their own Ruby version within it. How can I be sure that I test with the correct Ruby version for the Puppet agent? Or is there a support in the PDK to test against a variety of Ruby versions?
Yes. The second thing coming soon.
Yeah. and the first thing is we'll always map a Ruby version of PDK with compatible Puppet versions.
Yeah. It's going to be all about running the tests or validations or whatever against a Puppet version, and then PDK will know how to map that to the right Ruby version.
I have a related question. Do you plan to provide official Docker image with PDK and all of its dependencies? Because when I tried to use it a moment ago, it installed some gems on my machine, which I tried to avoid.
Oh, because you installed from a gem?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So you installed the PDK gem?
No. I installed PDK, downloading it for my Mac image and using installer. But then when I run PDK validate on an existing module, it's asked me to. It started installing gems and stuff.
Yep. I think like one of the bullet points with the adapting adapting your existing modules to PDK is to evaluate your gem dependencies. So being able to merge the gem file that we provide in a new module with the gem file you currently exists so that there aren't any conflicts is part of the process.
I will add
Okay,
one other thing too, that when the PDK installs additional gems, those are not going into your system Ruby or anything. Like they're going into a PDK isolated cache directory. So,
Okay, thanks.
and I think we are out of time.